What's happening to our skies? Those wide expanses of blue, dotted with white cottony clouds, each unique, a story all its own. What if we told you that those skies you grew up with are rare now? Have you noticed? Look back at your old photos. You will see beautiful cobalt blue skies of years past. Those days are fewer and farther between now. Even look at advertising in today's magazines and commercials. The horizons are almost always white. Go outside and look up. The skies you are seeing today are most often composed of a hazy, bland overcast that's created from jet trails that spread throughout the sky like an opaque roof, blocking the sun. It's called climate engineering, or geoengineering. What you are about to see will shock and challenge you. Geoengineering causes climate change.
We have to keep geoengineering on the table. There are a variety of schemes that have been discussed for geoengineering. A classic example is injecting reflecting particles into Earth orbit. The danger, of course, with geoengineering is we don't understand the system well enough to predict its responses in detail, and that means that you will do something that has side effects that are worse than the dimension of the problem you're trying to cure.
The news is filled with talk of climate change, yet no one wants to talk about government programs called geoengineering, SRM, solar radiation management, HARP, or weather modification, whereby planes spray toxic chemicals into our atmosphere for the stated purpose of actually creating climate change. Yes, our government is intentionally creating climate change. In September, Russia urged the UN to include geoengineering in the climate science report. The UK writes about this topic almost every day in The Guardian, and there are over 100 bills before the Senate today about climate science and weather modification. You no longer live in a world of blue skies and natural weather. The air you breathe, the sun you see, and the rain that falls is now being controlled and manipulated by geoengineering.
Well, believe it or not, this is actually not rain. This is called chaff. This is something that the military actually let out of their aircraft a couple hours ago. It can be plastic, it can be aluminum, and basically it's something that they emit from the aircraft in order to confuse radar, and it's used in times of war, obviously, but obviously just an experiment here over the Fort Myers area.
In October 2013, Monsanto bought Climate Corp for $1 billion. The world's largest corporation known for genetically altering the food we eat is now also in the business of weather and climate science. This is terrifying.
An increasing amount of days saw these patterns occurring in the skies overhead and a subsequent diminishment of my solar uptake. And it increased with every year. So about 2004 is when I really started my investigation as to what could be happening in the skies above, because it was too inconsistent. One day would be a grid pattern, and another day would be virtually nothing, with very similar atmospheric conditions. I've been studying meteorology since the late 90s as well. So clearly there was something happening, and it took no time at all to come to the geoengineering issue and a mountain of data. I researched the subject of geoengineering, which seemed to describe exactly what I was seeing in the skies above, which was solar obscuration. That's the primary goal of SAG, stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, and SRM, solar radiation management. The primary goal of these patents, like stratospheric Wells box seeding for reduction of global warming, is a primary patent, and the stated goal is to block the sun. And quite clearly that's what was happening with my solar PV system. So seeing the first ingredient in that patent is aluminum, I began to do rain tests First test was 7 parts per billion, which according to a hydrogeologist was already quite high, given my location, a filtered, forested location. It's not near any sort of industry, urban setting, anything. Subsequent tests over the next 5 years escalated as much as 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum in a single rain test. So if you have virtually every dot connecting, and we know these materials aren't coming from China, that's the first thing many people state, but California Air Quality Resources Board has done studies on the aerosols from China, and aluminum simply is not amongst them. Metals don't float across oceans with the exception of mercury. Global dimming is a term most are not familiar with, and the latest figures show fully 20% of the sun's direct rays that reached the planet several decades ago no longer do. I mean, this is the biggest elephant in the room, absolutely the biggest in the room. And I believe that if it could be brought to a level where there was enough cover for all the scientists, all the meteorologists, all the biologists, all the academia that knows this is going on, I believe they would pour from every corner. I do, but they would have to have the cover, because I know people with California Department of Fish and Game that are absolutely beside themselves that this is going on.
Aerosol geoengineering looks like it is so cheap that the cost is basically not going to be an issue. That means that implementation decisions will be risk-to-risk decisions. The risk of doing it against the risk of not doing it. And it makes the problem of how we govern it fundamentally harder and different than normal. But I think the more we do research, the less easy this will look, the more complicated the environmental effects will look. And that's a good thing, because right now it looks too easy. So I think that if we do more research, we're likely to find out that it's harder and more complicated than we thought, and that the side effects are harder to manage. Of course, the opposite reaction is possible. It's an empirical question how people will actually react to knowledge about this. Another reaction is to say, if these crazy scientists are so concerned about putting CO2 in the atmosphere, they want to think about these things, then that might actually mean we should be more serious about the risks of CO2 in the atmosphere. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard, it's more like free riding on our grandkids. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard, it's more like free riding on our grandkids.
Numerous air quality studies, including from CARB, California Air Quality Resource Board, have named submicron-sized particulates as being particularly harmful for human respiration. Through all the discussions today, I have not heard any mention of this fallout, and has this been studied, and also the effects of a highly reactive metal like aluminum on toxifying soils and waters?
The collaborators of mine working on the aerosol scheme are actually folks from Carnegie Mellon who focused on human health impacts. And while we haven't published it, that was the very first thing we did, was do the order of magnitude calculation in a level of pencil and paper, but with an expert on human health impacts about whether there could be an issue. And for aluminum or other particles, there are a lot of toxicological things that need to get looked at seriously.
Toxicological issues show up in a lot of different ways as far as risk factors. For example, if you want to stay away from food that is pesticide residue on it, you have a choice with regard to the type of food you can eat. So you can stay away from pesticide residue, you can stay away from GMO'd food, and buy food that's either organic or from local farmers. If you have concerns about the tap water, again, you have a choice about what you can do. You can either drink bottled water or you can filter your water. However, with regard to the aerosol schemes and the geoengineering that's going in the sky, we have no choice. We all breathe. We breathe every day. We take 16 breaths a minute. And as a result, what's being sprayed, we are inhaling. It's going through our bloodstream, and it's embedding itself in tissues. These type of particles can cause things like Alzheimer's, autism, and cancer.
The ingredients of the patents held by government contractors are composed of solutions made of toxic metals, such as aluminum, barium, strontium, and manganese. High-altitude airplanes inject these solutions into the atmosphere, a process called aerosol spraying. This clandestine activity could be killing us and our planet. You can identify this easily. Just go outside and look up. You will see the trails that these jets spray often span from horizon to horizon. They sometimes appear in an unusual grid pattern or large X. Then if you really pay attention and watch them over a period of a few hours, you will see them spread out across the sky, turning a beautiful blue sky into a milky, hazy white.
The government is sovereign, and if the government of Russia or Great Britain or the United States chooses to try to slow down global warming particularly of the Arctic, they'll have every governmental law possible to authorize it. And the liability of the collateral damage from it will be exactly that, because the other argument is to do nothing. Well, they've already said that the only way to quickly change climate, given the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, is geoengineering, by changing the cloud cover to be more reflective so that the radiation doesn't get into the atmosphere. That's what they've already said. So now the only question is when.
Geoengineers now are moving very quickly to get legislation passed to spray the primary ingredients into our sky, knowing the damage that we have had not only to human health, we've seen aluminum-related illnesses go through the roof, but what free-form aluminum oxide does to our environment is devastating. And it literally destroys crops, it destroys forests, it destroys our Earth. We have an Earth that is being molested. Our ozone layer is being shredded from top to bottom.
So U.S. Title 50 was government legislation that said you cannot do open-air testing on people. But when you actually read down through the legislation and through the law, it actually has areas in which you can conduct open-air testing. It's under War and Peace, and it talks about what they can do for military purposes. So basically what they were trying to do was say that you can't do open-air testing, you can't use the atmosphere for military purposes, which is all great and dandy. You couldn't do that on the American people, which was all fine, but then they allowed for times for peaceful purposes in which they could experiment with, changing the jet stream or releasing certain chemicals to get some kind of forest sequestering, or to see if some biological agents would have a harmful effect on certain people. So all those things were allowed and are still okay because it's in times of peaceful purposes.
It's one of those pieces of legislation that sounds great on the cover and on the surface, and then when you actually read through the text of it, there's all sorts of exemptions that allow them to do exactly what the legislation says it's not supposed to allow.
Unexplainable weather phenomena. Bizarre snowstorms, Hurricane Sandy, flooding, drought, tornadoes that come out of nowhere. It is not unexplainable. It's very explainable if you go online and search these words: geoengineering, climate engineering, Skyder Alert, HARP, chemtrails, geoengineering watch, climate science, weather modification, SRM, and the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, or AMEG. You will be amazed at what you find.
Chemtrails change the amount of sunlight and energy that pierces the atmosphere. I mean, it's in several articles that I can show you. So the phenomena of changing how much sun gets and energy gets into our atmosphere that heats it up is printed every day. It's just printed in such a way as to not say this is a tool for climate change. It's saying it is in fact a phenomena that will in fact change the climate by reducing the amount of sun that gets into our atmosphere. Geoengineering is one of the things that are on the table, and it'll probably be on a large enough scale that it'll be pretty obvious to everybody.
And it becomes more obvious every day. Look at the way the contrails persist and become a white blanket over the entire sky.
Essentially, contrail is a type of cloud. It's essentially a cirrus cloud. When it persists long enough, basically what happens is it will spread out, the winds will just blow it, and it becomes basically indistinguishable from a cirrus cloud.
As a pilot, you notice contrails, and no contrail ever lasts for a half an hour, an hour even. And some of these lately ones we've been seeing, of course, they last all day.
We knew enough to know that contrails form behind the engine. It's just a byproduct of combustion of jet fuel at altitude. There's water vapor along with a few other things, and at temperatures 30, 40, 50 below zero, they form ice crystals. But then they normally dissipate.
when a contrail persists, it's persisting because the air is saturated, supersaturated for ice, which means that if any ice crystals appear in the air, then they will grow because there's moisture in the air above this certain level at which the ice will grow.
That's a normal contrail. Now the stuff that we're seeing now, that's coming right from the trailing edge of the aircraft. And it's much more intense, much more volume of material in the air. And it lasts for sometimes a day. It's not a natural phenomenon.
Look at this photograph of the sky. I thought that the clouds looked a little strange. That's why I took some pictures. But then when I saw a plane go through the cloud and leave a void in the cloud that lasted for half an hour or so. Planes don't leave holes in clouds. They're just not clouds.
When you begin to introduce clouds to the sky, you're changing how much energy from the sun reaches the Earth's surface. That's a given. You're increasing cloud cover. And we've had a marked increase of high cloud cover, in particular cirrus and altocumulus clouds over the last 30 years. The quotient, or the ratio between low clouds and high clouds, has nearly doubled the number of high clouds. And what you're doing is trapping heat. You're keeping some out, but when it comes to nighttime, you're pulling a blanket over. All right, let's just take a summer afternoon in LA. We have a high cloud bank come in. It won't come in the morning, it'll come in the afternoon. So we get all of that morning sunshine, we get all of that midday sunshine, the clouds come in, the sun begins to set in the west, the clouds thicken up. You've already got your heat in for the day. And then the clouds stick around for 70% of the night, and the heat stays. And so in late 2004, I started buying cameras. I bought 2 little webcams and then 2 other mini DV Canon cameras. Little tripods, stuck them out around the house. And then I bought 2 computers and time-lapse software. And so I could get north, south, southwest, and then east. I was hoping to catch movement of clouds, things happening with the clouds so I could deliver a better forecast at night. What I caught after 4 months in was in about 25 minutes, and I'll show it on the video, is a series of flights. And what happened was one plane was coming along, and it was a relatively dry day in April. A plane would come along and only a little bit of the trail would stick. Only a part of it remained visible. What was curious is that another plane came along and hit precisely the middle of that segment. And I'm like, that's odd. And then another plane came along and hit the end at an angle, not bisecting or perpendicular, but off at an angle. And I thought, the light went off. There's something they're doing with geometry. It is establishing and setting up these resonances, these zones, because what I had observed with a time-lapse camera is that the atmosphere had literally been layers. Each 2, 3, 4, 5, 8,000 feet is probably variable from day to day. And the clouds would come up and then literally be chopped off. But that would only happen after a plane had come through. And then the storm would collapse. And you can see it today. You can step out anytime you see thunderstorms beginning to go, the planes will be there. You know, so it all comes back to the sun. The sun is the power source for this solar system. The sun drives the weather.
The stated goal of geoengineering is to block the sun, and as a result of getting insufficient light, we are not able to synthesize as much vitamin D as we need. Vitamin D has been shown to prevent things like prostate cancer, breast cancer, and colon cancer. To compensate for the lack of sun, it's definitely possible to supplement your diet with vitamin D. However, the nanoparticles that we're breathing in as a result of the aerosol schemes can potentially cause lung cancer, which, according to the World Health Organization, is the #1 cause of cancer death worldwide.
You know, if you get awakened to the issue that there's something going on, maybe it's a really benevolent attempt to avert climate change, right? And even that, you could say, geez, it's kind of backfiring, right? It seems to be trapping the heat in rather than just reflecting the sun back. But let's say even if it was working, and let's say that's what the intent was, then still to be informed about what tools people are using to do that are having this kind of impact on the health and well-being of human beings and the planet, that's a legitimate request.
I spent 6 years in the Air Force as an instructor pilot in Texas. I started looking into weather modification. I found that they were trying to modify the weather beyond normal cloud seeding. And it just seemed very different to me to see these trails in the sky that weren't disappearing. You can follow a normal contrail. If you see the origin of it going across the sky, the contrail will follow it and be disappearing at the same rate as the plane is moving through the sky. But these others, they don't disappear. They expand horizontally and vertically, and they just stay there. And I said, okay, this is what it is. This is geoengineering.
In the fall of 1998, I was asked by my employer, Environment News Service, a worldwide wire service dealing with environmental issues, to have a look at a VHS videotape. When I viewed the tape, I started laughing, frankly. I thought, here's an hour and 10 minutes of shaky video footage of contrails. After 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, I stopped laughing because as a former pilot and ocean navigator, I was well familiar with normal contrails, and what I was seeing on this videotape was not acting like a normal condensation trail. The trails coming out behind multiple airplanes, instead of dissipating, were lingering, spreading across the sky, until a blue sky day had turned into a milky, murky overcast. In my first story for Environment News Service in January 1999, I said that these mysterious contrails were sickening Americans. The illness patterns coincided precisely with so-called heavy spray days, particularly on weekends. People would see this gritting, unusual activity, aerial activity in the sky. They would start to cough, they would get asthma attacks, severe enough to send them to emergency rooms. Doctors were telling the New York Times, we've never seen anything like this. People were dying in great numbers in the early days of this project, and the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, went on record and said, we really don't know what this is. It's not the flu. They called it an epidemic of mortalities. That was their phraseology for this.
When is this?
This is 98, 99, and 2000, the winter months. This was reported in the United States, Canada, in Peterborough, Ontario. The hospital there had 307 acute asthma admissions in a single day. In Birmingham, England, 8,000 people died in 3 weeks, mostly elderly. It was in all the papers, BBC. They were using meatpacking trucks as portable morgues. It was very drastic. All I can say as a journalist is this was coincident to videotape and visual reports of tic-tac-toe patterns and unusual gritting in the sky. Exactly coincided. So very dangerous program.
I'm standing on the roof of my building in the Bronx, New York. And as you can see, the entire sky, as far as you can see, it's blanketed with these chemtrails. Stretching all the way over to Manhattan or to New Jersey. There's another one being made as we speak. Saturday, March 10th, 2012. It's around noontime. And look at this. You can see this chemtrail here. It almost looks as if it's falling onto the ground. You can see how it's dissipating at the very end there. Falling into the river or falling.
In October of 2013, a heavy snow event occurred in South Dakota, even though temperatures were near 50 degrees and the surrounding regions were even warmer. The unexpected snow killed over 100,000 head of cattle, costing farmers millions of dollars in losses. So how were these immutable laws of nature violated? Experts believe it was due to artificial ice nucleation. Natural ice nucleation is the freezing of water droplets around particles in clouds at very low temperatures that result in snowfall. For snow to fall at far above freezing temperatures, there must be unnatural particles for water to use as a nucleus at high altitudes where the temperature is well below freezing. This method was discovered by Vincent Schaefer and now perfected by various geoengineering patents and methods.
In regards to the Arctic and geoengineering, it appears that at this point the geoengineers are so desperate to maintain whatever ice is left in the Arctic that they are doing anything at any cost to the planet. We've seen massive high-pressure domes over the Pacific Northwest, which has literally fried us here with record temperatures for extremely long periods of time. That high pressure spins the jet stream clockwise around us, picks up moisture in the Gulf Coast, floods the East Coast as it goes up the eastern seaboard, and it appears this is directly connected to what they're trying to do in the Arctic. So in June, because of this mechanism of moisture that they are artificially ice nucleating over the Arctic, they were able to extend Arctic sea ice about the surface area. Now, one must separate the surface area from the mass, two different things. So they extended surface area 40,000 square kilometers in June, which was very anomalous, had all the scientific community scratching their heads. But 40,000 kilometers of surface area is very small in regard to the Arctic.
If we don't put an end to weather modification, you can look forward to more and more devastating storms created by geoengineering.
Geoengineers are proposing spraying 10 to 20 million tons of toxic aluminum and other substances into our sky for the stated goal of cooling our planet.
So let me distinguish these two different kinds of geoengineering as clearly as I can. So the first one is we call solar radiation management, and that's the idea that you could put mostly reflective particles or other means to make the Earth whiter.
Weather is part of our planet, it's part of our nature. Weather drives everything. Weather drives all of our food. So yeah, weather is creation. It's part of creation, and many people call that God. And people who play with our weather or control our weather are playing God because they want power. Yeah, you control the weather, you control the planet.
Why would Monsanto buy Climate Corp for $1 billion except to control the weather for their own purposes? There are others who have laid out strong evidence that, and it's right there in the government documents, that they want to control the weather as a weapon. Full spectrum dominance is one of the titles of one of their programs. Also, when you have heavy metals in the atmosphere, it increases the capacity of their radar devices and also of their electromagnetic antennas, like the HARP antenna up in Alaska, is more powerful if they can bounce their beams off of the aluminum and back down to the Earth or up into the ionosphere.
There's actually a government report called Owning the Weather, where they talk about doing just that for military purposes, where they talk about how if they can create weather, it actually is an advantage to them for, military reasons.
The IPCC is the organization within the WMO, and that's the international organization dealing with weather. And it basically says that climate change is human-caused and will have impacts on us now, and those impacts will become more and more significant over time.
I believe the data shows very clearly for anyone who truly does objective research that although they can cool regions, very large regions, temporarily, and of course toxically, the overall effect is a much worsened warming.
The real issue in chemtrails is what causes them to be persistent. If you can cause a chemtrail to be consistent, that is persistent, that is to stay out in the atmosphere longer, so it can create a cloud. What is the mechanism for that? What has changed in that jet to cause the chemtrail behind it to persist as opposed to dissipate? Is that a natural phenomenon because we have more moisture in the air? Is it a natural phenomenon because the stratosphere is getting colder? Is it an additive that they put to jet fuel? Is it truly a chemical that they spray with the jet afterwards? The very term persistent chemtrail is used so as to indicate it's different from a chemtrail. So my question is, what's the additive? What got added to cause it to be persistent.
Our kids now are being taught that in some science classes with certain science books. The science book Essential Interactions that's put out by Centerpoint Learning Incorporated. In their section called Global Warming, they have a photo of a jet, and the photo of the jet's titled Particle Air, and it has a caption that says, "Jet engines running on richer fuel can add particles to the atmosphere to create a sunscreen." And that's in a section called Solutions for Global Warming. So we're even teaching our kids now that, you know, hey, what you're seeing is normal. You know, this is something to benefit you. This is something for your safety.
The most common story about chemtrails is that they don't exist, but it's just common contrails. But I have been for years, literally for a decade, asking people to show me any pictures of persistent patterned contrails prior to 1997. Haven't seen one yet. So something seems to have started up then. So then the story, the next most common story is, well, this is to protect us from global warming. We're not really doing it, but we should be doing it in order to protect us from global warming.
You know, questioning it does take courage these days. And so I just think that we need to step up to that, even though you'd think that that kind of questioning and concern on behalf of ourselves and our planet and our future generations would be welcomed. In fact, it's not, and you have to be a little bit uncomfortable to bring up the subject and engage new people. And what I've found is that it actually feels good, and there are many more allies than we might be inclined to think right off the bat, because when you come at it with this kind of minimum sufficient understanding that, you know, if you were being sprayed with toxic chemicals, would you be okay with that? If I could show you that that's what's happening, would you want to join with me in helping to stop it? I really don't know too many people who would say no to that.
I can say this, that for any skeptic, I would ask them, why would I not believe geoengineering is the source of this when, one, the patents describe exactly what we see in the air. The express goal is to block the sun. Two, the ingredients on the ground are exactly what those patents state as primary ingredients. Three, you have administration officials like John Holden of the Obama administration openly stating their support for geoengineering. Four, you have scientific groups like the Arctic Methane Emergency Group openly calling for emergency wartime geoengineering. It can easily be found and researched by anyone who chooses to look up the AMEG group, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group.
My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it. The danger, of course, with geoengineering is one I was referring to a moment ago. We don't understand the system well enough to predict its responses in detail, and that means there's always a danger if you try to engineer the system on a large scale that you will do something that has side effects that are worse than the dimension of the problem you're trying to cure with the geoengineering in the first place. There are a variety of schemes that have been discussed for geoengineering. A classic example is injecting reflecting particles into Earth orbit.
What is occurring is the deliberate and systematic alteration of the ecosystem of this planet through a physical means of injecting particulate matter, extremely fine particulate matter, into the atmosphere. I look at it at this point as a global scale operation, and I examined those questions about whether or not it was physically feasible to modify the entire atmosphere. And at the beginning, that seemed a little bit of a stretch. It was not a set answer to me at all. But you'll find when you study the atmosphere that actually it is quite feasible, and the atmosphere is much more delicate and fragile than many of us might realize.
The power of this kind of geoengineering, particularly when it's done secretly, is not only unethical, it's really lethal, and we need to stop it. We need to expose it, and we need to stop it.
I think one of the most effective things to do in connecting the dots is to really follow the money and figure out, okay, look, what are the ties between people forecasting the futures markets and people manufacturing the chemicals and making the delivery systems for the planes and owning the planes and getting the patents and on, you know, aluminum resistant seats and all of that. Like, to think what's involved in this process and follow the money in it and find out who's making a profit and what's the connection. And then that'll start unraveling other pieces.
Yeah, and what
of
are
the
those
puzzle.
corporations and who controls them?
Yeah.
And what's their motive ultimately?
Heating the ionosphere, injecting sulfur into the stratosphere, blocking the sun, stopping rainfall, dumping iron oxide into the ocean, bending the jet stream. While these ideas sound insane, they are very real. They are all part of geoengineering and weather modification, and they come with deadly side effects. What is happening to the bees? Have you heard about the massive fish die-offs? What about all the reports of birds dropping dead from the skies? Google these topics and you will see the peril that our ecosystem is in, and the urgent need to take action right now.
Right now, we're about 30 miles northeast of Redding, California, in a boreal forest that receives about 70 inches of rain a year historically. So we're in an area that was historically quite lush, very little mortality with the trees. And now, in the last 10 years, we've seen a steadily and ever more rapid decline of various types of trees. It's a very diverse ecosystem, very biodiverse forest, but what was completely canopied forest with almost no sunlight coming through is completely different. Trees are losing their foliage, black oaks are giving up their leaves. The conditions are quite extremely different from previous years, and we have bark on black oaks burnt from the bottom to the top, completely fried off the trees, so the core wood is exposed. So we have very different conditions than we had 10 years ago.
Organically speaking, what I've seen in the local ecology over the last 2 or 3 years is typical bark burn. In its starting phases, it just looks sick, brownish, tannish. First it gets kind of discolored, and if it's a scaly type tree, it scales off. In later phases, the bark actually falls off and you've got a scar on the south side of a tree. Most fruit trees have been showing increased susceptibility to bark burn or scalding on the southern side, and that's why they paint fruit trees quite commonly on the trunk. But just lately we're seeing increased cases of that, especially where the bark is exposed to the sun, and it's getting really bad since about 2006.
Now here's dead firs right over here. Their feet are in the water. Their roots are in the water. This is not a lack of water. Let's take the examples of these trees. North-facing slope, very shaded, stream bed with water in it right now. Their feet are in the water. They're still dead. So obviously something else is going on here. I've had USDA scientists tell me off the record they know that what's killing the trees is not simply a lack of water, period. And many would say, or they try to say, that the aluminum should be in the rain, but anybody who studies that issue will realize, although aluminum is a very significant percentage of the Earth's crust, it is always bonded to other elements, usually bauxite. So aluminum does not exist in free form in the environment. It does not blow around in the rain unless it's been mined and refined and sprayed.
Scientists warn about extremely high levels of dangerous UVB radiation bombarding Earth. Could this be the consequence of damage caused by this geoengineering? Could this be what's killing trees from top to bottom? A stated side effect of geoengineering is ozone depletion. This is exactly what's happening now, and it's getting worse every day.
If you just want to trust government, you can just let it all happen. But if you want to try to get a public dialogue going, I think the best thing is for state governments who are at risk to begin inquiring as to what the government is going to do. I'm just wanting the government to be truthful so that the citizens can make honest decisions about their future.
One of the things that was really impactful for me was knowing that the United States has been caught over 30 times doing toxic experimenting on human population. That's documented, it's factual. We had all of the information at Thrive in our movie fact-checked. And in order to be really responsible about what it is that we're claiming here, because once you get the facts, then you can mobilize in a more leveraged and effective way.
It sounds like a bad James Bond movie or something like that. Is, this sinister plot to control the world and depopulate and everything. But it's time to wake up and realize that there are very sinister people in the world who have risen to the top of the power centers in the government, military, corporations, media, and so forth, and they are in league with each other in overt organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, and also in secret societies, meeting even more covertly to plan exactly this type of activity.
I do not believe that it's commercial aircraft spraying this. I believe it's military covert operations that are being involved in actually not following the airways in the sky as designed for regular commercial traffic. However, they have point-to-point destinations which can crisscross. They aren't on the radar. It's being diverted over military channels, is my feeling. And that's going to be pretty hard for people to come forward and prove that.
Pictures don't lie. That's all there is to it. It's like the way the government uses red light cameras to enforce traffic violations. The photographs are evidence. It's that simple. Look at this picture of Central Park. Does this look normal to you? I mean, the coloring, the weird purples and greens and blues that are in these stripes. I remember this day, December 6th. I was walking towards the Empire State Building and I saw a plane cutting directly across the building. And I called Steve and I said, Steve, we got to take some pictures today, man. So we went out and we got these photographs, unsuspecting people just going about their daily lives. In the meantime, look up. What do you see? Does that look normal to you? I'm a director of photography by trade. That's what I do. I take pictures. I've been doing this for 20 years plus, and I can tell you what I'm seeing in the skies is different now than it's ever been.
You can't hide this. You simply can't hide this. That's why I believe this issue will be known one way or the other.
We want people to look into this. We want people to question. We want people to look into what geoengineers are denying they're doing, but state they urgently want to do.
Should the government be allowed to control the weather? Do you think you have a right to natural sunlight? Do you think you have a right to clean air and clean water?
What they had said to us at the time was that we're not going to spray over water areas and watersheds. And the fact remains is that they can't control where the mist drops. Any wind, any type of different movement, faulty GPS. They cannot say that only this particulate matter is going to fall in this particular space. They can't control that. And that is a huge flaw with this whole concept of aerial spraying.
The CDF actually did tests to see how much spray landed on exemption areas. And the gentleman from CDFA that did that actually had said that in some of the exemption areas there was just as much particulate matter as there were in the treated areas.
So do I think there's persistent contrails in the sky? Yes. On a clear day you can go up and look at them. Anybody who wants to look at them can see them. They're not short streams of cloud-like things you can see. They're very long. They go from horizon to horizon. So there isn't a question of what they are, or are they in existence? They are. The literature talks about it, including the IPCC. So the word persistent contrail is in the scientific documents where they're observing phenomena.
So I'm hopeful that as the discussion enlarges around geoengineering and the public is invited to enter the debate or enters it regardless, that chemtrails will be brought out of the closet, will be brought forward, and that the chemtrail community, the movement, can enter this discussion, and I would suggest, first of all, by dropping the word chemtrails. It's become a poison word, and we can use it as code among ourselves, for the media, for the public. We use the words of the scientists of the international debate. We call it stratospheric aerosols, which is what they are. We call it SRM, solar radiation management. We call it geoengineering. We call it climate engineering. All of those are accepted scientific terms. If we can do that, we can bring this whole chemtrails discussion into the broader discussion of geoengineering and finally have a public influence on a very dangerous program.
The public must be made aware of this assault on our planet, on our environment, on our children. Since our government leaders deny that there is a crisis, we must bring this issue to light. We must shine a light on geoengineering. Our future depends on it.
So now let's talk about what we're going to do. What can we do? What are the options?
We need public oversight, we need public disclosure, so this technology, these actions and these massive budgets can be used for the people and not against them.
The reason I'm in this battle, one that I never wanted in my worst nightmare, is because if I can't walk out my door and breathe without sucking in a lungful of toxic metals, and my children can't breathe without sucking this stuff in, I simply have no choice but to try as hard as I can to expose this issue.
There's no doubt in my mind that the spraying will have a negative impact on human health. I see cancer rates spiraling. Right now we see 1 in 2 people getting cancer in their lifetime. Already 1 in 8 women get breast cancer. I see those things continuing to rise unless we do something about it.
The only power we have to put an end to geoengineering is to raise our collective voice and shine a light on this issue before it's too late.
What do you do is that there's power in numbers. We all have to work together to stop the geoengineering, and we have to do things to stop the spraying because it affects every single person on the planet that breathes. And if we don't take care of the problem, we're going to have real health issues, and that's a whole other problem.
Aerosol spraying involves a number of different mechanisms for releasing particles, types of aerosols, polymers into the atmosphere for a variety of purposes. Aerosol spraying can happen at different levels. It can happen at a high altitude level in restricted airspace. That's primarily for military purposes. It can happen at maybe a medium type of level, a medium type of elevation, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 feet for cloud seeding and snow enhancement. Aerosol spraying can also happen at a low level for pesticide and agricultural use. So there's a wide variety of applications that can use those techniques.
I was having my coffee, reading the newspaper, and found out that later that day, the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the USDA were planning to hold a public meeting in Santa Cruz regarding the light brown apple moth and their plans to eradicate it, involving aerial spraying.
The aerial spray for the light brown apple moth was proposed as a 10-year program, a $1 billion program to go on for 10 years, over 7 million people throughout all these residential areas throughout Northern California. And it was based on the premise that a complete comprehensive mowing of the area was needed in order to contain this so-called pest. However, places like the Pebble Beach Golf Course and a few other high-end neighborhoods were excluded from the spray. So even the basic premise of blanketing the area, except for a few spots, it's like, that doesn't make any sense. These notions that some people would just take the authority to spray a toxic spray that we're not even informed about against our will for 10 years, and we're supposed to just take it. It's like, wait a minute, what is the thinking behind that? And I want to interrupt that thinking. That's a dangerous level of entitlement.
A real turning point in the public tide of emotion about this was when a young military couple in Monterey with a new baby were doused several times with the spray, and immediately their baby started having problems. Then it got worse and worse, and they took the baby to the hospital with severe respiratory problems, and the baby almost died. And that got publicized, got in the papers and so forth.
So we found out that some of the chemicals that we had to fight long and hard to even have revealed to us, that those chemicals were in fact endocrine disruptors. And what that means is that they disrupt the reproductive cycle. And at the same time, we see human fertility going down. I know all kinds of young women having trouble getting pregnant.
Some of the stuff would cause cancer, it would disrupt our reproductive systems, have allergic reactions, it had mood-altering effects, some of these chemicals. It was a nightmare.
The notion that a corporation or a government would say, well, yes, some people are going to be harmed by this, but that's just a necessary part of, kind of the fallout of something. It's like, well, wait a minute, let's question that. Why is it, and what if it happens to be your child that's the sacrificial kid?
So people started standing up and saying, no, you cannot experiment on us without our permission, without everybody's permission.
The subject of filing a lawsuit came up, and so we decided to file a lawsuit and get as many plaintiffs on board as people that felt willing to put their name on it. We had 11 plaintiffs, including 2 Santa Cruz City Council members and the mayor of Monterey, myself, and 7 other individuals. And we filed a lawsuit against CDFA and USDA in federal court in San Jose and represented ourselves. And to put a stop to the spray until environmental impact report was done.
To cut to the chase, in 6 months, we ended up stopping the entire program, $1 billion from the President and Homeland Security, with probably under $50,000, but a lot of volunteer efforts and a lot of expertise. We stopped that program cold, and it has not continued to this day. So it's a template. We were being sprayed covertly, in terms of the ingredients, at 1,000 feet over 7 million people. Now, that was the moss spray. With the chemtrails, they're spraying at 30,000 feet, and they're pretty much spraying the entire globe. After nuclear radiation, it's the second most dangerous thing, I think, going on the planet, in history.
I really believe that when people are informed, they will be concerned. And when they're concerned, then we can organize and take the necessary action. And I'm completely confident that we can stop chemtrails.
We'll need to watch the movie. We need to contact our powers that be in government. We need to become a voice in making a choice about stopping the spraying before it affects us personally and before it affects us globally.
Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm excited that we're all together tonight because what we're going to be talking about could be changing your life just tonight, tomorrow. When you look up in the sky, you may never look at the sky the same way again. Well, I'm happy to introduce to you our first speaker tonight. His name is Dane Wigington. We're going to talk about what geoengineering actually is. And so, Dane, would you share with us, what is this word?
It involves a number of applications of spraying aerosols into the atmosphere, of manipulating these aerosols with what's called ionosphere heaters. How many of you have heard the term HARP? We've got a pretty educated crowd here. You've probably heard the term ionosphere heater. That's what HARP is. There's not just one facility. We believe there's at least 26 ground-based facilities. There's also SBX, which are sea-based facilities too. But the bottom line with geoengineering is this: it's to try to play God with the weather, period. Many ask, why would anyone want to do this? But we should ask ourselves, why wouldn't they want to do this?
And just not too long ago, David Keith is a Harvard scientist who was on the Colbert Report, and he has a new book called The Case for Geoengineering. So that's how mainstream this is getting. Tell us what your research shows.
David Keith is the world's most recognized geoengineer. Yes, I've been with David Keith. Some in this room may have seen film footage of David Keith and myself at a conference in 2010. They only allowed 3 questions with about 100 journalists. I was one. But the question to Mr. Keith was, with all the presentation he had done, I heard nothing of any study on human respiratory effect, environmental toxicity. He tried to dodge the question by saying, well, we studied this, and paraphrase, he said there was so much junk in the air already, a little bit more wouldn't hurt. So this is the sort of cavalier attitude that relates around this issue. We have about 150 patents, and the stated purpose for geoengineering is to slow a runaway greenhouse effect again. But all available data indicates we may be 2 decades into a runaway greenhouse effect right now. It totally disrupts the hydrological cycle, as anybody in California knows, cuts the rainfall out. Yes, it's raining in places, but globally overall rainfall precipitation is down, should be up. In a warming planet, it must go up. The laws of physics say it has to go up, but it's not. There should be 7% more moisture in the atmosphere for every degree of warming. Why do we have less rain? There's only one explanation: because the atmosphere is full of particulates.
We've had a wonderful panelist sitting here silent, and I want to bring him into the mix. Dr. Doug Levine is actually the author of this book, Answer to Cancer. And he has dealt quite a bit with the health effects of some of the chemicals that are associated with geoengineering, some of the chemicals that are clearly outlined in some of the patents. And so I'd like to bring Dr. Doug Levine into the conversation to answer the question, how is this harmful to us? Why should each one of us care about what's going on with geoengineering? What's the human health impact?
When I first met George and Dane, I was really unaware. I've kind of noticed these things in the sky, but never really kind of noticed them. So George and Dane brought to my attention the things that they're spraying in the sky. So I did some research on my own. And I had a lot to read about. Anybody familiar with the term of risk factor? Okay, a risk factor is anything that will increase your risk of getting a problem. There are two types of risk factors. There is modifiable risk factor and a non-modifiable risk factor, and I'm going to explain the two. If you are a smoker and you're smoking, you have the potential of getting lung cancer, right? That is a modifiable risk factor, meaning that is a behavioral change that you can make to stop smoking and reduce your risk of getting cancer. Another modifiable risk factor is eating bad food, right? If you heard the term garbage in, garbage out. So if you eat bad food, over time that's going to make you sick. So you can modify your risk factor of getting sick by eating healthier. That is a modifiable risk factor. Geoengineering is a non-modifiable risk factor. That is a risk factor that is affecting our human health that we have no control over. And as a result of being a non-modifiable risk factor, it affects everybody. Because the sky is the biggest room in the house, and what they're spraying is going into our water, it's going into our soil, it's going into our food, and we are breathing it in.